Delphine Whitmore had perfected the art of being invisible long before she ever set foot in Jefferson High School. The skill had been born from necessity during her childhood, refined through years of moving between her divorced parents' homes, and honed to razor sharpness during the tumultuous months following her family's relocation to this unfamiliar city. At Jefferson, she moved through the sprawling hallways like a shadow given form, her slight frame and deliberately quiet demeanor making her nearly unnoticeable to the casual observer. Her auburn hair, which caught fire in direct sunlight but appeared mousy brown in the fluorescent glare of classroom lighting, hung in loose waves around her pale face, creating a curtain she could hide behind when conversations grew too intense or attention threatened to find her. The oversized sweaters that comprise most of her wardrobe seemed to swallow her small frame whole, transforming her into a shapeless figure that most students' eyes simply slid past without registering. Behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been unfashionable even when she'd first gotten them 3 years ago, her green eyes held an intelligence that most people never bothered to notice, along with depths of experience that would have surprised anyone who took the time to truly look. She preferred the anonymity, or at least she had convinced herself that she did, during the long months of adjustment to yet another new school, another fresh start that felt increasingly like a false beginning. The irony of her situation was not lost on Delphine, though she rarely allowed herself to dwell on it for long. What nobody at Jefferson High School knew, what none of her teachers suspected, and none of her classmates could have possibly imagined, was that this quiet, seemingly fragile girl had spent the last 8 years of her life training in mixed martial arts at her uncle's gym on the rough side of town. Every evening after school, while her classmates were attending football practice or basketball tryouts, gossiping at the local mall, or lounging in their bedrooms scrolling through social media, Delphine was across town in a converted warehouse, perfecting her strikes against heavy bags, learning submission holds that could render a grown man unconscious in seconds, and building a strength that her carefully chosen baggy clothes completely concealed from the world. The gym itself was a testament to function over form, all exposed brick walls and industrial lighting, with the persistent smell of sweat, leather, and the liniment that fighters rubbed into sore muscles after particularly brutal training sessions. It was a place where pretense died quickly and ability was the only currency that mattered. The regulars there knew Delphine not as the invisible girl from Jefferson High, but as Marcus Whitmore's niece, the kid who could throw combinations that would make semi-professional fighters wince and execute takedowns with the kind of technical precision that took most people years to develop. Her uncle Marcus, a former UFC middleweight who had retired after a devastating knee injury ended his professional fighting career, had taken her under his wing during the darkest period of her young life. The decision hadn't been made lightly or quickly. When Delphine's parents had finally admitted that their marriage was beyond salvaging, when the shouting matches had escalated to thrown dishes and slammed doors, when 8-year-old Delphine had started flinching at sudden movements and speaking in whispers, her mother, Sarah, had reached out to Marcus in desperation. Sarah Whitmore had never approved of her brother-in-law's chosen profession, had spent years making pointed comments about the barbarism of cage fighting and the questionable life choices that led men to beat each other senseless for the entertainment of crowds. But when her daughter began showing signs of the anxiety and depression that comes from living in a war zone disguised as a family home, when Delphine started having nightmares and panic attacks, Sarah swallowed her pride and asked Marcus for help. The first time Marcus had seen his niece after the divorce papers were signed, she had been a hollow-eyed wraith of a child, all sharp angles and nervous energy, jumping at shadows and apologizing for existing. He had recognized something in her that reminded him of himself at that age, growing up in foster care, learning that the world was fundamentally unsafe, and that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. But unlike him, she still had family who cared, still had a chance to build something stronger than just survival instincts. Marcus had been careful in his approach, understanding that traditional therapy might not be enough for a child who had learned to distrust the adults in her life. Instead of lectures about self-esteem or confidence, he offered her something more concrete: the tools to protect herself and others, the discipline that came with mastering a difficult skill, and most importantly, the knowledge that she was stronger than she believed. The training had begun slowly, more like elaborate games than formal martial arts instruction. Marcus taught her to fall safely before he taught her to throw punches, showed her how to breathe through discomfort before introducing her to actual pain. He had learned from his own mistakes, understanding that producing a technically skilled fighter was worthless if the person wielding those skills was mentally unstable or emotionally damaged. "Real power comes from knowing you don't have to use it," he would tell her during their training sessions. Usually when she was frustrated by his insistence that she master defensive techniques before learning offensive ones. "Any idiot can throw a punch when they're angry. The real test is keeping your hands to yourself when someone deserves to get hit." He had seen too many talented fighters destroy their lives because they couldn't control their aggression outside the ring, had watched promising careers evaporate in barroom brawls and domestic violence arrests. He was absolutely determined that Delphine would never follow that path, that she would understand the difference between strength and violence, between power and cruelty. Every lesson came with discussions about restraint, about de-escalation, about the legal and moral responsibilities that came with being capable of serious harm. The training had been intense and methodical, progressing through years of carefully structured development. Delphine had learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from Carlos Santos, a soft-spoken man whose gentle demeanor masked a technical ground game that had earned him victories over opponents twice his size. The art of leverage and timing appealed to her analytical mind, the way a smaller person could control and defeat a larger opponent through superior technique and positioning rather than brute strength. Muay Thai came next, taught by Kru Siriporn, a woman who had fled political persecution in Thailand and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made everyone in the gym straighten their posture when she entered the room. Under her tutelage, Delphine learned to turn her shins into weapons, to deliver devastating kicks and knee strikes with the kind of precision that made the heavy bags shudder on their chains. More importantly, she learned the mental discipline that was at the heart of all traditional martial arts, the ability to remain calm and focused even when adrenaline was flooding her system. Traditional Western boxing rounded out her striking education, taught by Tommy Morrison, a grizzled former professional whose scarred hands could still generate tremendous power despite his advancing age. Tommy taught her the sweet science of distance and timing, how to slip punches by millimeters and counter with combinations that flowed like water, but hit like sledgehammers. Under his guidance, she developed footwork that would let her dance around opponents who were bigger and stronger, but lacked her technical training. By the time she reached her 16th birthday and transferred to Jefferson High School, Delphine had developed a fighting style that emphasized efficiency over flashiness, technical precision over raw power. She could have easily held her own against most adults in a physical confrontation, let alone the teenage bullies who seemed to rule the social hierarchy of her new school. But more importantly, she had developed the mental discipline to recognize when violence was and wasn't appropriate, when walking away was the stronger choice, and when intervention was necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The bullying had started almost immediately when Delphine transferred to Jefferson at the beginning of the spring semester. Moving from the small private academy where she had spent her freshman year to this massive public institution that felt more like a minimum security prison than a place of learning. The transition had been jarring in ways she hadn't anticipated. not just because of the size difference between the schools, but because of the completely different social dynamics at work. At Sacred Heart Academy, her previous school, the small class sizes and strict disciplinary policies had created an environment where overt bullying was difficult to sustain. Students certainly formed cliques and engaged in social exclusion, but the kind of predatory behavior that thrived at Jefferson simply couldn't exist under the watchful eyes of nuns who had spent decades perfecting the art of maintaining order among teenagers. Jefferson High School, by contrast, was a sprawling complex of buildings that housed over 3,000 students, a barely controlled chaos where individual teachers were overwhelmed by class sizes that made meaningful intervention nearly impossible. The hallways between classes resembled nothing so much as a nature documentary about predators and prey, with clear hierarchies enforced through a combination of social pressure and barely concealed threats of violence. It was Delphine's quiet nature and slight build that made her an immediate target for students looking for someone to push around, someone who could be safely victimized without fear of serious retaliation. In the cruel calculus of high school social dynamics, she represented the perfect victim, isolated, apparently friendless, physically small, and psychologically withdrawn. To the predators who prowled Jefferson's hallways, she might as well have been wearing a sign that read, "Easy Target." Troy Brennan was the undisputed ringleader of Jefferson's most vicious clique, a stocky quarterback with bleached hair that he spent considerable time styling each morning and a perpetual sneer that seemed to be his default facial expression. He ruled the school's social hierarchy with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to those who had never faced real consequences for their actions, never encountered anyone willing or able to push back against their behavior. Troy's background was typical of the entitled bullies who thrived in environments like Jefferson. He was the son of a successful businessman who donated generously to the school's athletic programs, which had earned him a level of protection from consequences that he had learned to take for granted. His grades were mediocre at best, but his performance on the football field and his family's financial contributions to the school district had created a buffer between him and any serious disciplinary action. More importantly, Troy possessed the kind of charisma that allowed him to recruit others to his cause, to surround himself with followers who were either too afraid to oppose him or too impressed by his apparent power to question his methods. He had an intuitive understanding of group psychology, knowing exactly how to make others complicit in his cruelty by making them participants rather than mere observers. His two constant companions were Jackson Pike and Becca Reeves, each of whom brought their own particular talents to the group's campaign of systematic harassment. Jackson was a lanky basketball player whose dead eyes and mean streak made him the perfect enforcer for Troy's schemes. Where Troy was charismatic and calculating, Jackson was simply cruel, taking genuine pleasure in the fear and discomfort of others. His height and athletic build made him naturally intimidating, and he had learned to use his physical presence as a weapon just as effectively as any explicit threat. Becca Reeves completed the trio, a cheerleader whose pretty face and winning smile masked a personality that was arguably more vicious than either of her male companions. She had perfected the art of social warfare, understanding better than anyone how to weaponize gossip, rumors, and social media to destroy her targets' reputations. Where Troy and Jackson relied on physical intimidation, Becca specialized in psychological torture, crafting campaigns of humiliation that were all the more effective because they appeared to be spontaneous rather than calculated. Together, they had made Delphine's life at Jefferson a daily ordeal that began the moment she stepped onto campus each morning and continued until she finally escaped to the safety of her uncle's gym each evening. The harassment was comprehensive and relentless, touching every aspect of her school experience and making it clear that there was no safe space, no moment of peace to be found within Jefferson's walls. The harassment had started small, but was clearly calculated, beginning with seemingly accidental encounters that gradually escalated in both frequency and severity. The first incident occurred during her second week at Jefferson, when Troy had accidentally shoulder-checked her near the chemistry lab as she was rushing to class with her arms full of textbooks and carefully organized notes. The impact had been perfectly timed and positioned to send her materials flying across the hallway while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. She had scrambled to collect her papers while other students stepped around and sometimes on them. Troy had stood over her with that characteristic sneer, making loud comments about how some people just don't know how to handle themselves in a real school. His tone had been conversational, almost friendly, but the message had been unmistakable. She was out of place here, inadequate for the challenges of Jefferson High, and he was the one who would be deciding how difficult her experience would be. The psychological warfare had escalated systematically from there, each incident carefully designed to chip away at her confidence and social standing, while avoiding the kind of overt aggression that might attract administrative attention. Whispered comments about her thrift store clothes became a constant background soundtrack to her school day, delivered just loud enough for her to hear, but quietly enough that nearby teachers couldn't quite make out the words. Her outdated sneakers, her quiet voice when teachers called on her in class, her habit of eating lunch alone. Everything became ammunition in their campaign to make her feel like she didn't belong. The nickname had emerged during her third week at Jefferson, during an American history class where Mr. Patterson had asked her to read aloud from the textbook. Delphine had always been a strong student, but her voice barely rose above a whisper as she read about the Constitutional Convention, partly from nervousness and partly from a deliberate attempt to avoid drawing attention to herself. When she finished the passage, Troy had raised his hand and, in a voice dripping with false concern, asked if the mouse in the back row could speak a little louder next time because he was having trouble hearing. Mr. Patterson had chuckled at what he perceived as harmless teenage teasing and had asked Delphine to speak up, completely missing the cruelty underlying Troy's comment. But Troy had dubbed her Mouse after that incident, and the nickname had stuck with the kind of viral efficiency that only the cruelest high school monikers possessed. Soon, even students who didn't actively participate in the bullying were using the name, effectively erasing her real identity and reducing her to nothing more than a timid creature to be pitied or ignored. The nickname became a weapon in itself, more devastating than any physical assault could have been. It followed her everywhere, whispered in hallways, called out during class changes, written on bathroom walls and desk surfaces where she would be sure to see it. Teachers who should have known better began using it casually, thinking it was just a harmless nickname that had emerged naturally from the student body. "Mouse, can you read the next paragraph?" Mrs. Henderson would ask in English class, not realizing she was participating in the systematic dehumanization of one of her students. Each time Delphine heard it, she felt a piece of herself disappearing, replaced by this diminished version that Troy had created for his own amusement and the entertainment of his followers. Mrs. Henderson, despite her good intentions, had become an unwitting participant in the bullying campaign, through her casual use of the nickname and her failure to recognize the dynamics at play in her classroom. Like many teachers at Jefferson, she had developed a kind of selective blindness to the social hierarchies that governed student interactions, focusing on academic content while ignoring the psychological warfare being waged right in front of her. The English teacher had noticed some of the tension surrounding Delphine, but had interpreted it through the lens of typical teenage social adjustment rather than systematic harassment. When Delphine's grades began to slip slightly and her class participation became even more minimal, Mrs. Henderson attributed it to the normal challenges of transferring schools rather than the deliberate campaign to isolate and demoralize her. Mr. Caldwell, the gymnasium teacher, was even more problematic in his response to the situation. Not only did he fail to intervene when Troy and his friends targeted Delphine during physical education classes, but he actually seemed to encourage the behavior through his own comments and reactions. During volleyball games, when Delphine would inevitably be targeted for serves that were clearly intended to humiliate rather than score points, Mr. Caldwell would chuckle and make comments about students needing to toughen up if they wanted to succeed in the real world. His philosophy seemed to be that bullying was a natural part of the school experience, a kind of social Darwinism that would ultimately make students stronger if they survived it. When Troy would make cruel jokes during physical education class, often at Delphine's expense, Mr. Caldwell would laugh along, reinforcing the message that such behavior was not only acceptable, but actually amusing to the adults who were supposed to be protecting vulnerable students. The cafeteria emerged as the primary battlefield where the worst incidents occurred. A massive space that could accommodate nearly 1,000 students during each lunch period, but felt more like a gladiatorial arena than a dining hall. Jefferson's lunchroom was a social battlefield where hierarchies were enforced through public humiliation, where reputation could be made or destroyed in a matter of seconds, and where the unwritten rules of high school survival were demonstrated daily through displays of dominance and submission. Delphine had quickly learned to navigate this treacherous environment through careful timing and strategic positioning. She ate quickly and quietly, usually choosing a corner table near the emergency exit where she could escape if necessary, always keeping her back to the wall so she could see potential threats approaching. But even these precautions couldn't protect her from Troy and his crew, who had made disrupting her lunch routine into a form of entertainment that drew appreciative audiences from other students. The incident that occurred on a Tuesday in mid-March had been particularly brutal, executed with the kind of theatrical timing that suggested considerable planning. Jackson had positioned himself perfectly along Delphine's usual route from the lunch line to her chosen table, creating what appeared to be an accidental collision, but was actually a carefully orchestrated ambush. His foot had shot out at precisely the right moment, catching her ankle just as she passed the popular kids' table where the maximum number of witnesses could observe her humiliation. Her lunch tray had gone flying in a spectacular arc, sending her turkey sandwich and chocolate milk spraying across the floor in a pattern that managed to splatter several cheerleaders' shoes and the expensive jeans of multiple football players. The entire cafeteria had erupted in laughter as Delphine scrambled to clean up the mess, her face burning with embarrassment that felt like physical pain, her hands shaking as she tried to gather up the scattered remnants of her lunch while hundreds of students watched and pointed. Troy had stood over her during the cleanup process, grinning widely as he offered mock sympathy that was calculated to be loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Careful there, Mouse. Maybe you need to work on your coordination. Or maybe they don't teach you how to walk properly wherever you came from. Is this how they do things at fancy private schools?" The comment had been accompanied by snickers from his friends and uncomfortable silence from everyone else, creating a moment of crystallized humiliation that Delphine knew would be replayed and discussed for weeks to come. Students who had witnessed the incident would retell it to others, embellishing details and adding their own commentary until it became part of the school's collective memory of her inadequacy and social isolation. But it wasn't just the spectacular public humiliations that wore her down on a daily basis. It was the constant low-level harassment that made every day feel like navigating through a minefield where any step could trigger an explosion of cruelty. Troy would wait for her at her locker between classes, forcing her to be late as he and his friends formed human barriers that she had to navigate around while they made comments about her appearance, her family, or her obvious status as an outsider. The physical intimidation had escalated gradually over the weeks, each incident pushing the boundaries a little further while staying just below the threshold that might attract serious administrative attention. Shoulder checks became harder and more frequent. Books were knocked from her hands with increasing regularity, always in crowded hallways where the perpetrators could blend into the crowd before anyone could identify them with certainty. During the crush of students moving between classes, Troy and his friends would form walls that forced Delphine to push past them, always accompanied by jeering comments about her size and apparent weakness. The worst part of the entire campaign was the way other students reacted to what they witnessed. Most simply looked away when incidents occurred, grateful that they weren't the targets and unwilling to risk drawing attention to themselves by intervening. Some laughed nervously, wanting to stay in Troy's good graces and demonstrate their loyalty to the social hierarchy he represented. A few seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what they witnessed, but none spoke up. None reported what they saw, and none offered Delphine any form of support or friendship. The message was clear and unambiguous. She was completely alone in this environment, isolated not just from potential allies, but from any adult who might be willing or able to help her. The social contract at Jefferson seemed to be that predatory behavior was acceptable as long as it was directed at acceptable targets, and she had somehow been designated as one of those targets through no fault of her own. Despite all of her training, despite knowing with absolute certainty that she could probably handle all three of her primary tormentors simultaneously without breaking a sweat, Delphine continued to endure the abuse in silence. The knowledge of her own capabilities made the situation even more frustrating, like being a chess grandmaster forced to play checkers with children who didn't even understand the rules of the game. They thought they were winning. Her uncle's lessons about control and discipline echoed in her mind constantly during these encounters, reminding her that true strength came not from the ability to inflict damage, but from the wisdom to know when such action was appropriate. Starting a fight at school would mean automatic suspension, possibly expulsion, and the consequences would ripple through every aspect of her life in ways that could follow her for years to come. It would disappoint her mother, who had already sacrificed so much financially to enroll her at Jefferson after their family's financial situation had deteriorated following the divorce. More importantly, it would prove to everyone around her that she was just another violent student who couldn't handle conflict appropriately, couldn't adapt to civilized society, couldn't control her impulses when faced with stress. She had seen how quickly school administrators made assumptions about kids who got into fights, regardless of the circumstances, that led to the violence or the disparity in size and aggression between the participants. One incident could follow her through high school and into college applications, creating a permanent record of behavioral problems that would overshadow any academic achievements. The college consideration was particularly important to Delphine, who had maintained excellent grades despite the daily harassment and saw academic achievement as her ticket out of this environment and into a better future. She had already begun researching universities with strong programs in her areas of interest, planning scholarship applications, and working toward the kind of academic record that would give her options when graduation finally arrived. A single violent incident could derail all of those carefully laid plans. But the real reason Delphine held back was more complex and deeply personal. She had seen what violence could do to a person's soul, had watched her uncle struggle with the aggression that had made him successful in the professional fighting circuit, but had proved destructive in his personal relationships. Marcus had shared stories about fighters who couldn't turn off their combative instincts outside the ring, who had destroyed marriages and friendships because they couldn't separate their professional personas from their civilian identities. She was genuinely terrified of what she might become if she allowed that part of herself to emerge in anger rather than the controlled environment of training. The control she maintained wasn't just about avoiding administrative trouble or maintaining her academic record. It was about protecting her identity as someone fundamentally different from her tormentors, someone who chose reason over violence and restraint over revenge, even when she had the power to choose otherwise. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest strength had become a source of weakness in this environment. All those years of training, all that knowledge and skill that had been developed through countless hours of practice and instruction, rendered completely useless by her own moral code and the institutional systems that consistently failed to protect students like her from predators like Troy. Every day became an exercise in endurance, a test of her ability to maintain her principles in the face of systematic psychological assault. She would arrive at school each morning with her jaw clenched and her shoulders squared, mentally preparing herself for whatever fresh humiliation awaited her, knowing that she had the tools to end her torment immediately, but lacking the moral flexibility to use them. The breaking point finally came on a Friday afternoon in late October, during what should have been a peaceful end to a week that had been particularly challenging, even by Jefferson's standards. Delphine had been especially careful that day, taking alternate routes through the school's sprawling complex and timing her movements to avoid the areas where Troy's group typically congregated. She had managed to make it through most of the day without any significant incidents, and she was beginning to allow herself to hope that she might escape to the weekend without further confrontation. The false sense of security was shattered when she heard the familiar sound of cruel laughter echoing from the main hallway near the administrative offices, a sound that had become so associated with her own suffering that it triggered an immediate stress response. But as she approached the source of the commotion, she realized with growing horror that this time the target wasn't her. Principal Williams was walking toward her office, her arms full of folders and administrative paperwork, her usually perfectly composed appearance slightly disheveled from what had clearly been a long and challenging day. Patricia Williams was one of the few genuinely respected figures at Jefferson High School, an administrator who had earned the admiration of both students and faculty through her fairness, dedication, and genuine concern for the welfare of everyone in her building. She was in her early 50s, with graying hair that she wore in a professional style, and a wardrobe that spoke to both competence and approachability. More importantly, she was one of the very few adults in the building who had bothered to learn Delphine's real name, who greeted her warmly when they passed in the halls, who had made it clear through small gestures that she saw her as a person rather than just another face in the crowd. During Delphine's first week at Jefferson, when she had been lost and overwhelmed by the school's size and complexity, Principal Williams had personally taken the time to help her find her classes and understand the building's layout. When other students had snickered at her obvious confusion and disorientation, Principal Williams had firmly but politely directed them to mind their own business and continue to their classes. Troy, Jackson, and Becca were clustered near the main office, supposedly waiting to speak with the vice principal about some athletics matter that probably involved their latest disciplinary infractions or academic deficiencies. But their attention was focused entirely on Principal Williams as she approached, her arms full of documents and her mind clearly occupied with the administrative challenges that consumed so much of her time. What happened next unfolded with the kind of horrible slow-motion clarity that occurs during moments of genuine crisis, when time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously, allowing observers to see every detail while feeling powerless to intervene. As Principal Williams passed their small group, Troy deliberately extended his foot across her path, timing the movement with the precision of someone who had clearly planned this moment of cruelty well in advance. She stumbled forward, her professional composure shattered as her files scattered across the polished hallway floor in an explosion of papers and forms that represented hours of careful work. But the humiliation was only beginning. In her attempt to catch herself and prevent a complete fall, her heel caught in the hem of her pencil skirt, and the fabric tore with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent hallway like a gunshot. The hallway fell completely silent, except for Troy's delighted laughter, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuinely malicious in his character. Principal Williams stood frozen in the aftermath of her fall, her professional dignity shattered as her torn skirt exposed more than was appropriate for any public setting, let alone a school where she was supposed to command respect and authority. Her face flushed deep red with a combination of humiliation and anger as she tried to hold the torn fabric together with one hand while simultaneously gathering her scattered papers with the other. An impossible task that only emphasized her vulnerability and helplessness in that moment. This was a woman who was accustomed to being in control of her environment, who commanded respect from students and faculty alike, now reduced to scrambling on the floor while teenagers laughed at her misfortune. "Oops," Troy said loudly, his voice carrying down the hallway with theatrical projection that ensured everyone within earshot could hear his mock apology. "Guess you should watch where you're going, Principal Williams. Maybe invest in some better clothes while you're at it. Seems like the administration budget isn't quite covering professional attire these days." The comment was delivered with the kind of calculated cruelty that revealed just how much thought he had put into this moment. How he had planned not just the physical assault, but the verbal humiliation that would follow. This wasn't an impulsive act of teenage stupidity. This was a premeditated attack designed to destroy the dignity and authority of someone who represented everything decent about Jefferson High School. Jackson and Becca dissolved into giggles that sounded more like the cackling of predatory birds than genuine human laughter, their phones already emerging from their pockets to capture photographs and video of the dignified woman's humiliation. In their minds, this was content gold, a moment of authentic cruelty that they could share across social media platforms for maximum viral potential, turning someone else's worst moment into their entertainment and social currency. Other students in the hallway stood paralyzed by the sudden transformation of their environment from mundane school corridor to scene of calculated abuse. Some seemed shocked by the audacity of what they were witnessing, unable to process that someone would deliberately attack a figure of authority in such a public and degrading manner. Others appeared uncomfortable but uncertain about how to respond, caught between their natural empathy and their ingrained understanding that intervening in such situations could make them targets of similar treatment. Something fundamental shifted inside Delphine as she watched the scene unfold, like a dam that had been holding back enormous pressure for months, finally reaching its structural limits and beginning to crack. The careful control she had maintained over her emotions and reactions, the disciplined restraint that had allowed her to endure months of systematic abuse, began to crumble as she witnessed this attack on someone who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Principal Williams wasn't just another victim of Troy's cruelty. She was an adult, an authority figure, someone who had demonstrated genuine care for students like Delphine, who didn't fit easily into Jefferson's social hierarchy. More than that, she represented everything decent about the school, the thin line between civilization and chaos that Troy had just crossed with calculated malice and theatrical flair. The calculated nature of the attack was what truly pushed Delphine beyond her breaking point. This wasn't the impulsive cruelty of teenagers acting without thinking. This was a deliberate assault on a woman's dignity, planned and executed with the kind of cold-blooded precision that revealed the depth of Troy's capacity for genuine evil. He had waited for the perfect moment when the hallway was crowded with witnesses, when Principal Williams was most vulnerable, with her arms full of documents and her attention focused on her administrative responsibilities. He had orchestrated this moment of degradation with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to planning football plays, considering every angle and timing, every element, for maximum impact and humiliation. The verbal assault that followed the physical attack had been rehearsed, crafted to cut as deeply as possible while maintaining the veneer of plausible deniability that had protected him from consequences throughout his academic career. As Delphine watched the dignified woman struggle to maintain her composure while holding together her torn clothing and gathering her scattered paperwork, something inside her mind crystallized with perfect clarity. This was exactly why bullies like Troy needed to be stopped, why systems that enabled their behavior were fundamentally corrupt, why good people couldn't simply ignore evil and hope it would eventually go away on its own. It was never enough for predators like Troy to target other students who were perceived as weak or vulnerable. Their cruelty would always escalate, always find new victims, always push boundaries further and further, until someone finally possessed both the ability and the willingness to push back with sufficient force to make them understand that their actions had consequences. The realization hit her with the force of religious revelation. Every day she had chosen to remain silent, every incident she had endured without fighting back, every moment she had prioritized her own safety and future prospects over taking a stand against injustice, she had been enabling this behavior to continue and escalate. Her restraint, which she had convinced herself was noble and mature, had actually been a form of cowardice that allowed Troy and his followers to believe they could act with complete impunity. Without conscious thought or deliberate decision, Delphine found herself moving forward through the crowd of paralyzed students, her years of training taking over in a way that felt both completely foreign and absolutely natural. Her backpack hit the polished hallway floor with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, like the opening shot of a battle. The sound causing several nearby students to jump and turn their attention toward her. The transformation that occurred in that moment was so complete and dramatic that students who had known her for months didn't immediately recognize her as the same person they had been dismissing and ignoring. Gone was the hunched posture that made her seem smaller than she actually was. Gone was the nervous energy that had characterized her movement through Jefferson's hallways. Gone was the apologetic way she had carried herself through the world, as if her very existence was somehow an imposition on others. In place of the invisible girl who had haunted Jefferson's corridors for months, there suddenly stood someone completely different. A young woman whose spine was perfectly straight, whose shoulders were squared with confident precision, whose movements carried the fluid, controlled grace of someone who knew exactly how dangerous they were and had finally decided to stop hiding that knowledge from the world. Her feet found their fighting stance automatically, muscle memory taking over as her body shifted into the balanced, ready position that her uncle had drilled into her during thousands of hours of training. Her hands, which had spent months clutching books and backpack straps in nervous tension, now hung loosely at her sides in the deceptively relaxed posture of someone who could explode into violent action in a fraction of a second. The change was so profound that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the hallway. Students who had been whispering and giggling about Principal Williams's humiliation suddenly fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but unable to quite identify what had shifted in the environment around them. Even Troy and his companions seemed to notice that something had changed. though they hadn't yet identified the source of their sudden unease. "Troy," Delphine said, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway with a tone that none of the students had ever heard from her before. There was no hesitation in her speech, no apologetic undertone, no suggestion that she was asking permission to speak or hoping not to give offense. This was the voice of someone who was accustomed to being heard and obeyed, someone who expected others to pay attention when she chose to speak. Troy turned toward her slowly, his initial grin faltering slightly as he processed the dramatic change in her bearing and demeanor. For a moment, he seemed genuinely confused, as if he couldn't quite reconcile this confident, dangerous-looking young woman with the timid victim he had been tormenting for months. His brain struggled to process the transformation, to understand how someone could change so completely in such a brief span of time. Well, he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that he tried to cover with his usual swagger. "Look, who finally decided to speak up for herself. What's wrong, Mouse? Getting brave all of a sudden? Did you finally find your voice, or are you just having some kind of breakdown?" Delphine moved closer with steps that were measured and purposeful, each footfall deliberate and controlled, in a way that made experienced fighters nod with unconscious approval. Her approach was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was the advance of someone who had already decided on a course of action and was now simply executing a plan with professional precision. "You're going to apologize to Principal Williams," she said quietly, her tone carrying absolute certainty about the outcome she expected. "Right now, in front of everyone here, you're going to help her gather her papers and you're going to show her the respect she deserves." The hallway erupted in nervous laughter from students who couldn't process what they were witnessing. The idea of the school's most notorious victim issuing ultimatums to its most feared bully seemed so absurd that it couldn't possibly be serious. This had to be some kind of breakdown, some psychological snap that would provide even more entertainment once Troy reminded her of her place in the school's social hierarchy. Troy's confidence returned as he realized his audience was still watching, still expecting him to maintain his dominant position in the school's power structure. In his mind, this was just another opportunity to assert his authority, another chance to remind everyone who really controlled the social dynamics at Jefferson High School. "Or what?" he said with theatrical bravado, spreading his arms wide to encompass the crowd of witnesses. "What are you going to do about it, Mouse? You think you're tough now? You think you can threaten me? You're still just a scared little nobody who doesn't belong here. Maybe it's time someone reminded you of that fact." He stepped forward confidently, clearly expecting her to back down as she always had before, his body language displaying the casual arrogance of someone who had never encountered serious resistance to his behavior. In his experience, verbal intimidation was usually sufficient to maintain control, and physical presence alone was enough to make most students submit to his authority. "I'm going to show you what happens when you pick the wrong person to mess with," Delphine said quietly, her voice carrying a note of finality that should have warned him about what was coming next. Troy stepped forward more aggressively, bringing himself well within striking range, while apparently expecting her to flinch or retreat, as she had done countless times before. His confidence was absolute, bolstered by months of successful intimidation and the presence of an audience that expected him to maintain his dominant position in the school's social hierarchy. "You think you're tough now? You're still just a scared little—" He never finished the sentence. Delphine's right hand shot forward in a perfect straight punch that caught him square in the solar plexus with the kind of technical precision that would have made her boxing instructor proud. The strike was delivered with exactly the right amount of force to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, her fist connecting with his body at the perfect angle to drive all the air from his lungs. while avoiding the kind of visible injury that might complicate her explanation to administrators. The punch was so fast and technically perfect that most observers didn't even see it happen. One moment, Troy was sneering confidently and moving forward to intimidate her. The next, he was doubled over, gasping for air as his face turned red and his eyes watered with the shock of sudden, overwhelming pain. Before he could even begin to process what had happened to him, let alone attempt to recover his balance or breathing, Delphine grabbed his extended wrist with both hands and twisted, using his own forward momentum against him in a classic Aikido technique that her uncle had made her practice thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. The leverage was absolutely perfect. Troy's body weight and aggressive movement, combining with her technical skill, to create a force that he had no ability to resist or counter. He found himself spinning helplessly through the air, completely out of control, his feet leaving the ground as physics took over and sent him crashing into the nearest bank of lockers with a resounding clang that echoed through the hallway like a bell announcing the beginning of a new era. The impact was loud enough to make several students jump and cry out in surprise. The sound of Troy's body hitting metal lockers, serving as an exclamation point to punctuate the complete reversal of power that had just occurred. He slumped against the cold metal surface, still struggling to breathe, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as his brain tried to process what had just happened to him. Jackson rushed forward to help his friend, his basketball player instincts finally kicking in as he realized that the social order he had relied upon was suddenly under attack. But his athletic reflexes, honed for sport rather than actual combat, were no match for Delphine's years of systematic training in techniques specifically designed for real-world self-defense situations. She read his movement like an open book, recognizing the clumsy, telegraphed charge of someone who had never been in an actual fight, someone whose size and reach had always been sufficient to intimidate opponents without requiring any real fighting skill. Her feet moved in the precise pattern that Marcus had drilled into her during countless training sessions, her body flowing like water around Jackson's attempted tackle. As he stumbled past her, off balance and confused by her evasion, she grabbed his shirt with both hands and executed a textbook hip throw that would have earned enthusiastic applause in any martial arts competition. Jackson's long frame flew over her hip with surprising grace, his basketball player coordination useless against a technique he had never encountered and couldn't begin to counter. He hit the polished hallway floor with an impact that knocked the wind out of him completely, his limbs sprawling awkwardly as he struggled to understand how someone so much smaller than him had managed to throw him through the air like he weighed nothing at all. The landing was hard enough to remind him that this wasn't a game or a display of dominance, but an actual fight with real consequences. Becca's scream pierced the air as she raised her phone to record what she had initially expected would be Delphine's humiliation and Troy's triumphant reassertion of his authority. In her mind, this was going to be content gold, a video that would go viral and cement her own status as someone who documented the social hierarchies that governed Jefferson High School. But her cheerleader reflexes, developed through years of choreographed routines and supervised practices, were absolutely no match for someone who had spent nearly a decade training in combat sports with professionals who understood the difference between performance and survival. Delphine was already moving toward her with the fluid, predatory grace of a natural fighter, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. A quick, controlled strike to Becca's wrist sent the phone clattering across the floor, the expensive device skidding under a nearby bench where it would be forgotten in the aftermath of what was about to unfold. The strike was precise enough to disable without causing serious injury, delivered with just enough force to make Becca's hand go numb and her fingers lose their grip on the phone. Before Becca could even register what had happened to her phone, Delphine executed a perfectly timed foot sweep that put the cheerleader on the ground beside her male companions. The technique was simple but effective, using Becca's own momentum and balance against her in a way that left her sitting on the polished hallway floor with a confused expression on her face. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds from the moment Delphine threw the first punch to the moment all three of her tormentors were sitting on the floor in various states of shock and confusion. To the witnesses who had gathered in the hallway, it felt like watching a masterclass in controlled violence, a demonstration of technical skill that was almost artistic in its precision and efficiency. Troy was slowly pulling himself up from the floor, one hand pressed against his ribs where they had impacted the lockers, his face a mask of shock and disbelief that gradually transformed into rage as he processed the fact that his reputation and authority had been destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses. Jackson was curled in a ball, holding his ribs and groaning softly as he tried to recover from the impact of hitting the floor. Becca sat where she had fallen, staring up at Delphine with wide, frightened eyes that suggested she was finally beginning to understand that there were consequences for their behavior. The hallway was completely silent, except for the heavy breathing of the three bullies and the whispered conversations of students who were trying to process what they had just witnessed. Every person present stood frozen, unable to reconcile the quiet, invisible girl they thought they knew with the dangerous young woman who had just systematically dismantled the school's most feared clique with clinical efficiency. Delphine stood over Troy, her breathing steady and controlled despite having just engaged in physical combat. For a moment, she could see genuine fear in his eyes, for the first time since she had known him, could recognize the vulnerability of someone who had just discovered that the world was a more dangerous place than he had believed. She could see that he was beaten, humiliated in front of the entire school, his carefully constructed image of invincibility shattered beyond repair. One more strike could put him down completely, could give him a taste of the helplessness and fear that he had forced her and countless other students to experience on a daily basis. The temptation was enormous, the opportunity for revenge almost irresistible. Instead, she stepped back and extended her hand toward Principal Williams, who was still clutching her torn skirt and staring in amazement at the dramatic reversal that had just occurred in her hallway. The older woman's face showed a complex mixture of gratitude, concern, and professional worry about the implications of what had just happened. "Are you all right, Mrs. Williams?" Delphine asked, her voice returning to its normal tone as the controlled aggression drained out of her posture and bearing. The principal took the offered hand gratefully, allowing Delphine to help her to her feet with a dignity that had been temporarily shattered but was now reasserting itself. Yes. Thank you, Delphine. That was..." She paused, searching for words that could adequately capture what she had just witnessed. "That was very brave of you, very impressive, but also very concerning from a disciplinary standpoint." Troy finally managed to stand up straight, his face flushed with anger and humiliation as he realized that his entire social position at Jefferson High had been destroyed in less than a minute. The rage in his expression was mixed with something else. Something that looked disturbingly like respect, as if he was finally beginning to understand that he had been systematically underestimating someone who was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "You're going to pay for this, Mouse," he said, his voice shaking with a combination of pain and fury. "You think this is over? You think you've won something? This isn't finished between us." Delphine turned to face him with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation, her green eyes meeting his with steady confidence that made it clear she wasn't intimidated by his threats. The nickname that had once made her cringe now seemed powerless to affect her, as if she had outgrown its ability to define her. "My name is Delphine," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the silent hallway. "And yes, this is over. All of it, the bullying, the harassment, The systematic cruelty that you've been inflicting on students who couldn't fight back. It ends now." The conviction in her voice seemed to drain the remaining fight out of him completely. Troy looked around at the crowd of students who were staring at him, no longer with the fear or respect that had once defined his social position, but with the kind of morbid fascination that people reserved for watching someone's complete downfall and public humiliation. He had been exposed as a coward who only picked on those he thought couldn't fight back, revealed as someone whose entire identity was built on bullying people who were unable or unwilling to defend themselves. The carefully constructed image of strength and dominance that had defined his high school experience was gone, replaced by the reality of someone who had just been thoroughly beaten by the person he had most enjoyed tormenting. "Come on," he muttered to Jackson and Becca, both of whom were slowly getting to their feet with expressions that suggested they were still trying to process what had happened to them. "Let's get out of here." As the three of them limped away, moving with the careful deliberation of people who were injured and embarrassed, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Students whispered excitedly about what they had witnessed, many pulling out their phones to call friends and share the news that Jefferson High's social hierarchy had just been completely overturned by someone they had all dismissed as powerless. But several students remained in the hallway, looking at Delphine with a new kind of respect and curiosity. Among them was Ryan Castellanos, a quiet boy from her chemistry class who had always seemed kind and intelligent, but had never spoken to her directly, probably because associating with her would have made him a target for Troy's group as well. He approached her cautiously, his expression mixing admiration with genuine concern for what the consequences of her actions might be. "That was incredible," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the whispered conversations that were still occurring around them. "I've wanted to do something about Troy and his friends for months, but I never had the courage. I never—" He trailed off, shaking his head in amazement. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Delphine smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The constant tension that had defined her existence at Jefferson High was gone, replaced by something that felt like freedom, like the ability to be herself without fear of consequences. "My uncle owns a gym across town," she explained, picking up her backpack and slinging it over her shoulder with easy confidence. "He's been training me in mixed martial arts since I was 10 years old. He taught me that real strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to walk away." "Why didn't you ever fight back before?" Ryan asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "You could have ended this months ago." The question hung in the air as Delphine considered her answer, thinking about the complex web of considerations that had kept her from acting despite having the ability to defend herself. "Because I wanted to be better than them," she said finally. "I didn't want to become the kind of person who solves problems with violence, who uses strength to intimidate others. I thought I could outlast them, that they would eventually get bored and find other targets." She glanced toward the end of the hallway where Troy's group had disappeared, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "But I finally realized that some people only understand consequences. They won't stop hurting others until someone makes them stop, until they understand that their actions can't continue without repercussions." Principal Williams had managed to tie her jacket around her waist to cover the tear in her skirt, restoring some measure of professional dignity to her appearance. She approached Delphine with a complex expression that mixed gratitude with the kind of professional concern that comes with having to maintain order in an institution filled with teenagers. "Delphine, I need you to come with me to my office," she said gently but firmly. "We need to discuss what just happened here. I'm grateful for your intervention, but I also have to address the fact that violence occurred in my school." Delphine nodded, understanding that there would be consequences even for justified self-defense, even for protecting someone else from harassment and assault. But as they walked toward the administrative wing, she noticed something that made her heart lift despite the prospect of disciplinary action. Students were stepping aside respectfully as they passed, many of them nodding or offering quiet words of support and encouragement. The whispers that followed her weren't cruel anymore. They were impressed, even awed by what they had witnessed. For the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, she felt like she was being seen as a person rather than a target. "Thank you," Principal Williams said quietly as they walked. "Not just for defending me, though I appreciate that more than you know, but for finally standing up to behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place. I've been trying to address the bullying problem at this school for years, but it's difficult when victims don't report incidents and witnesses don't come forward." "I should have said something earlier," Delphine admitted. "I should have reported what was happening instead of just trying to endure it." "You were protecting yourself the best way you knew how," Principal Williams replied. "And ultimately, you did what needed to be done when the situation became intolerable. Sometimes the system fails and people have to protect themselves and others." In the days and weeks that followed, the dynamic at Jefferson High School shifted dramatically in ways that surprised everyone involved. Troy and his friends seemed to shrink into themselves, no longer strutting through the hallways with their previous arrogance and entitlement. They avoided Delphine completely, giving her a wide berth whenever they encountered her in the corridors or cafeteria. More importantly, their systematic bullying of other students decreased noticeably as word spread throughout the school about what happened when they picked the wrong target. The video of the confrontation, captured by multiple student phones, despite Becca's failed attempt to document Delphine's expected humiliation, had spread through social media with viral speed. But rather than simply glorifying violence or celebrating revenge, the footage had sparked broader conversations about bullying, institutional failure, and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witnessed systematic cruelty. Delphine found herself reluctantly famous, thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted, but she used the attention to advocate for better anti-bullying policies and more effective intervention strategies. The incident had revealed the extent to which Jefferson High's administration had been failing its most vulnerable students, allowing predatory behavior to continue unchecked as long as it didn't result in the kind of dramatic confrontation that might attract negative attention from parents or district officials. The viral nature of the video had forced school officials to acknowledge problems they had previously been able to ignore or downplay. More importantly, other students throughout Jefferson began standing up for themselves and each other in ways that created a cascading effect of positive change. The culture of silent complicity that had allowed bullying to flourish was gradually replaced by something healthier, something that resembled an actual community rather than a collection of predators, victims, and frightened bystanders. Students who had been targets of harassment found their voices, emboldened by Delphine's example, to report incidents they had previously endured in silence. Bystanders became more willing to intervene when they witnessed cruelty, understanding that their silence had been a form of participation in the systematic dehumanization of their classmates. The changes weren't immediate or universal, but they were noticeable enough to create a different atmosphere in the school's hallways and classrooms. Teachers who had previously ignored signs of bullying began paying closer attention to student interactions, and administrators implemented new policies designed to address harassment before it could escalate to the point where students felt compelled to defend themselves through violence. Delphine found herself with genuine friends for the first time since transferring to Jefferson High. Ryan Castellanos had become a close companion, and their friendship had gradually blossomed into something deeper as they spent time together studying, talking about their shared experiences of feeling invisible at school and discovering common interests they had never been able to explore safely. She learned that Ryan had been writing poetry in secret, just as she had been hiding her martial arts training, and that his apparent indifference to the social hierarchies at Jefferson had actually been a carefully constructed defense mechanism designed to avoid attracting the attention of predators like Troy's group. His quiet intelligence and genuine kindness had made him an obvious target for bullying, but his careful invisibility had protected him from the kind of systematic harassment that Delphine had endured. Other students began approaching her as well, drawn by her reputation for standing up to bullies, but more importantly, by her obvious intelligence and integrity. She discovered that Jefferson High was full of interesting, creative, thoughtful people who had been hiding their true selves to avoid becoming targets, and that the toxic social environment had been preventing genuine connections from forming between students who might otherwise have become close friends. The disciplinary hearing that followed the confrontation had resulted in a 3-day suspension for fighting. But Principal Williams had made it clear both publicly and privately that she understood the circumstances that had led to the incident. The suspension was largely a formality designed to satisfy district policies that required consequences for any physical altercation on school property. "I don't condone violence as a solution to conflicts," Principal Williams had told her during their private meeting in the administrative office. "But I also can't condone the systematic harassment you endured, or the failure of our systems to protect you and other students from predatory behavior. Sometimes, the institutions that are supposed to keep people safe fail in their responsibilities, and individuals have to protect themselves and others." The principal had also made it clear that the incident would not be treated as a typical fighting suspension on Delphine's disciplinary record. Instead, it would be documented as self-defense in response to ongoing harassment, which would prevent it from affecting her college applications or scholarship opportunities. Troy had also been suspended, not just for his role in the confrontation, but for the extensive pattern of bullying behavior that finally came to light when other students felt safe enough to report incidents they had previously kept secret. The investigation that followed revealed months of systematic harassment directed at multiple targets, behavior that had been ignored or inadequately addressed by school officials who found it easier to look the other way than to confront popular students whose families had influence within the district. His athletic eligibility had been suspended pending a comprehensive review of his behavior, and several college scouts who'd been considering him for football scholarships had withdrawn their interest after learning about the bullying allegations and seeing the viral video of his humiliation. The consequences extended far beyond high school, affecting his future prospects in ways that would follow him for years to come. Jackson and Becker had faced similar consequences, with their participation in organized harassment campaigns resulting in suspensions from athletics and extracurricular activities. The systematic nature of their cruelty, revealed through the testimony of multiple victims who finally felt safe enough to come forward, had shocked even administrators who thought they understood the extent of the bullying problem at their school. As Delphine sat in her uncle's gym several weeks after the confrontation, working through her training routine with renewed focus and appreciation for the skills he had taught her, she reflected on how much her life had changed and how much she had learned about herself and the world around her. The gym felt different now, not just because she saw it with new eyes, but because her relationship with her training had fundamentally changed. Where once it had been a refuge from the difficulties of her life, a place where she could develop strength and skills that she hoped never to use, it was now a place where she could appreciate the full value of what her uncle had given her. "You did good, kid," Marcus said. watching her work through a complex series of combinations on the heavy bag with the kind of technical precision that comes from years of disciplined practice. You used exactly the right amount of force to stop the threat without going too far. That's what real martial arts is about. Control, not destruction. His pride in her accomplishment was obvious, but it was tempered with the kind of concern that comes from understanding the full implications of what she had been forced to do. He had spent years preparing her for the possibility that she might need to defend herself or others, but he had hoped that her intelligence and good judgment would allow her to avoid situations where violence became necessary. More importantly, he continued, you maintained your principles even when you had every reason to want revenge. You could have seriously hurt those kids, could have made them pay for months of humiliation and harassment. Instead, you used just enough force to stop their behavior and protect someone who couldn't protect herself. Delphine smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like a physical sensation. She had found her voice and her strength, not by becoming like her tormentors or by abandoning the values that defined her, but by refusing to let others define who she was or what she was capable of becoming. The girl who walked through Jefferson High's hallways now was fundamentally different from the one who had tried to remain invisible for so many months. She carried herself with quiet confidence, spoke up when she witnessed injustice, and had become someone other students looked up to as an example of integrity under pressure. But the most important change was internal, a shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. She no longer believed that strength meant avoiding conflict at all costs, or that maintaining her principles required accepting victimization. She had learned that sometimes the most moral choice was to stand up and fight, that protecting others might require actions that were uncomfortable but necessary. The nickname Mouse had disappeared completely from the vocabulary of Jefferson High School, replaced by the kind of respect that comes from recognizing genuine strength of character. Students who had once dismissed her now sought her advice and friendship, understanding that her quiet demeanor concealed depths of wisdom and courage that most people never develop. At Jefferson High, she was no longer invisible, but more importantly, she was finally, truly herself, someone who had learned to balance compassion with strength, restraint with action, and principle with practicality in ways that would serve her well throughout her life. The scared, isolated girl who had transferred to Jefferson months earlier was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood her own worth and wouldn't allow others to diminish it through cruelty or intimidation. The transformation was complete, and it had required her to discover not just her physical capabilities, but her moral courage and her willingness to stand up for what was right, even when doing so carried significant personal risks. She had become exactly the kind of person her uncle had hoped to help her become, strong enough to protect herself and others, wise enough to know when such protection was necessary, and principled enough to use her strength only in service of justice rather than revenge. The bullies had indeed picked the wrong woman to mess with, but not because she was physically dangerous. They had chosen to target someone whose character was fundamentally stronger than their cruelty, someone who possessed the rare combination of power and restraint that made her truly formidable. In the end, that was a lesson that extended far beyond the hallways of Jefferson High School, a truth about strength and integrity that would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead in her life.